I want to talk to you about Hugo Adam Bedau. Hugo Adam Bedau is an abolitionist. He believes we should abolish the death penalty. His theory is grounded in what's called the analogy of self-defense. He acknowledges that as the individual has a right to defend themselves, so society has the same right. Now, why would he say that? Well, because society is an aggregation of individuals. We can live solitary lives by ourselves, but when we choose to get together, we need certain rules of engagement. If I have the right as an individual to defend myself, when we all get together as a society, we not only maintain the individual right to defend ourselves, but as a society, we reserve the right to defend ourselves as well. And he's okay with that. The analogy from self-defense is okay. The way he defines the limits on society's ability to defend itself is something called the police rule of law. The police rule of law says that you have the right to defend yourself in proportion to the amount of force that's going to be used against you in a violent act. In other words, if someone comes at me with a pencil, I can defend myself. I might have a pencil in like kind, or I might have some other instrument. But to take out a gun and just shoot that person in the head or shoot him in the heart, for Hugo Adam Bedau, according to the police rule of law, which states that you're allowed to defend yourself with the degree of force that you anticipate is going to be used against you, using a gun on someone with a pencil would not be a lawful action. Again, if someone comes at me with a weapon of a murdering weapon, a gun or a knife, I have a right to defend myself. He's also agreeable to the fact that if there's going to be any leniency granted, it's going to be to the person who's under attack rather than the person who's doing the attacking. Now, how do we take that into the area of capital punishment? Here's Hugo Adam Bedau's argument. He says, once we've incarcerated a murderer, whether it's a professional killer, a serial killer, a premeditated killer, or someone who kills out of a crime of passion, they are no longer a threat to society. They may be a lethal threat within the confines of the jail or the prison, but to society, they are no longer a lethal threat because they no longer have access to society. In other words, the general welfare of society is now protected from them. You go back to the analogy of self-defense, they are no longer going to be able to use lethal force again, so that we are not permitted to use lethal force in order to keep them from murdering again. He is not against putting people in prison for life without parole. He is not against incarcerating them and removing some of the amenities that we allow our prisoners in jails. He's not against putting them in isolation for most of the remainder of their lives. After all, they have egregiously taken someone's life. There's no justification for doing that. So he's not into coddling them. He's just saying that he doesn't see the value in the death penalty, according to his analogy of self-defense, that we meet force in like kind. If they're incarcerated, they're no longer a lethal threat to us. Why not put them away? He deals with a cost issue by reducing the amenities that they have available to them. They can also work off their jail time. They can do some things that are productive, that allow some of the costs to keeping them incarcerated to be deferred. So he's got a view that's completely different from Ernst von den Haag. If you remember, Ernst von den Haag is a retributionist. He believes in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Adam Bedau does not want to coddle murderers, but he doesn't see any value in executing them because he is not a retributionist. For him, he is someone who believes in prevention. If we lock up an individual who's a murderer, they no longer have the capacity to murder the general population. We know that this does happen in the confines of jails and prisons, but most of us are not there. Most of us choose not to put ourselves in that situation. It's unfortunate when it does happen, but at least society's conscience in Adam Bedau's mind is of a clearer sense because we don't overreact to murderers and use the same methods that they use to justify killing someone to execute them. Added to that, there's also this issue, and we've known now since 1976 that 138 people who have been sentenced to death row and have been sentenced to capital punishment. It turns out through further DNA evidence in about 25% of the cases, someone else confessing to the crime or different evidence coming up that shows that the person who was judged guilty of murder is in fact not guilty of murder. About 138 people have been released from death row. We could have easily, therefore, killed 138 innocent people. Now, did the evidence point to them? Yes. Nevertheless, they're innocent people. We know that there are innocent people. There may, in fact, be people we have executed who were innocent, but we haven't discovered evidence to prove that yet. From a statistical point of view, it's hard to imagine that we've discovered 138 since 1976 and that there are absolutely none that we've executed that were in fact innocent. So again, Adam Bedau says, in the interest of preserving the innocent ones, we could incarcerate the true murderers, the true killers, for the rest of their life. We may end up incarcerating an innocent person, but at least we're not executing them. And he sees that the execution of the innocents is the most egregious form of injustice that can be performed by a society that's entrusted with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We acknowledge that innocent people for all levels of crimes are incarcerated for all periods of time. But when we can correct it, we do try and correct it. And when we have the death penalty as one of the penalties for presumed guilt in murdering someone, and then later we find out they're innocent, there's no way to restore that person in any way, shape, or form. At least someone who's been on death row, say 25 years, and we find out they really didn't commit that murder, at least they have some part of their life left. We can even make a monetary restitution. But once we execute them, there's no way to reestablish justice in their lives at all.